Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's class. There is a handout available. I'm putting a link to that in the chat box right now. The chat box is open, so if you have any questions for me, feel free to type them in there. I will be able to answer them once my presentation is over. Just oh, hi, Teresa. It's good to see you again. Yeah, I know. I still have family out in Berkshire County. They got a ton of snow. All right, so just a few things before we get started. First, this class is being recorded, and I will be sending a link to everyone who registered once it's up on our YouTube page. Everyone will be getting a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to my slides, as well as the handout and the chat transcript. So don't worry if you miss anything that came up in the chat, or if you miss anything on my slides, you'll be getting all those tomorrow. And oh, hello, Regina from Dayton. Okay, so here we go. So before we get going, we acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning. Deliberations and public engagement will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, free to all. Okay, so for those of you who haven't been to one of my classes before, I'm Jessie Wheeler. I am the genealogy specialist here at the Boston Public Library. I work in the Research Services Department, which is at the Central Library in Copley Square. So just one more note, I am covering national resources, but I am going to have a section that focuses specifically in Massachusetts. We are a Massachusetts-based public library, so my presentations do tend to focus on Massachusetts, but I will be going over a lot of general resources. Okay, so this is just what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about some good things to know about when you're doing military research. Then we're going to go over BPL resources, and then we're going to talk about other resources. So this is the section where we're going to cover a lot of stuff in general. So some good things to know when you're doing military records research. The name of the person you're researching is of utmost importance. You can't really do any kind of research without at least having the person's name. It's basic stuff. The other things that would be helpful to know would be the state where they enlisted or where they were drafted from. That's not necessarily the state where they lived, especially during the Civil War and sometimes during the Revolutionary War. Folks sometimes would travel to neighboring states or to enlist in different units. So that was something that happened. So if you are looking for a particular record, you're going to want to know where they enlisted or where they were drafted. The other thing you're going to want to know is the approximate dates of their service. So are you looking for someone from the Revolutionary War, from the Civil War? Do you know approximately when they were in the service? So what records you're going to find, it really largely depends on what time period you're looking at. The other thing you're going to want to know is you're going to want to know what exactly you're looking for. So what kind of records do you want? So are you looking for something like a complete personnel file? Are you just looking for an enlistment record, a draft card, something else? That's something you want to have a good idea of. This will help those of us who help folks doing this kind of research help you better, because we can't find things for you if we don't know what you want. There we go. So a few other good things to know. So for conflicts that take place on US soil, so this would primarily be the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, cities or towns that have any significant ties to military action. So any places where battles took place, for instance, a great example from Massachusetts would be Lexington and Concord. They'll often have their own collections related to whatever the conflict was. So that might be a national park. The National Park Service might have a location there, or there might be a historical society that might have a dedicated collection. The local library might have a dedicated collection related to the conflict. So that's something else to keep in mind. If you know a particular engagement that your ancestor was involved in, you can check where that was if it was on US soil. So this is really going to be mostly effective for 19th century and earlier conflicts. And depending on the time period you're researching, you may or may not be able to access certain records. So, and this is generally true for, especially for the colonial era, folks weren't necessarily saving records with the purpose of having their descendants or other people in future generations looking for them. So that's older records. For more recent records, that might be restricted, especially if the person you're researching is still alive. And if you're not their next of kin, then you will probably not be able to access those records. So there are restrictions for recent records. So that's something also to keep in mind. For instance, I could not put in a request for my grandfather's record. He served in World War II. My mother had to do it. So I filled out the form for her and then she signed it because she knows I'm interested. And she wasn't really, but I wasn't allowed to request it, only she was, because she was considered next of kin. So, and this is also helpful if you know the name of the unit that your ancestor or relative served in. If you just do a general search on Google, you might turn up a unit history, or someone might have written a book. We have a lot of regimental histories from the Civil War. I have one for the unit that my great-great-grandfather served in, and his death was actually mentioned in it. So that was pretty interesting. So that's something that if you know, you might be able to find a history of the regiment, and there might be information about your relative or your ancestor in that. Okay, so first we are going to talk about BPL resources. So the BPL has a lot of resources, although I will say it does primarily focus on what we have, does primarily focus on earlier conflicts, so the Revolutionary War, some of the colonial wars, and especially the Civil War. So we have a couple of databases that if you live in Massachusetts, you can access through us. Also, so Ancestry Library Edition is a big database. So that's pretty widely available all over the country. So that's something you can check with your local library to see if they have. So just because if you don't live in Massachusetts, you'll probably still be able to find somewhere where you can get that. So they have a ton of stuff for military records. Oops, there we go. Yeah, they have draft and enlistment records. They have headstone applications, which are pretty interesting. I'm going to show you one of those in a bit. Muster rolls, and they just have lots and lots of things. So I'm going to take a quick look at them. So again, so this is because I can access this because I'm in the library. You won't be able to access this outside of the library. But if you live in, again, most libraries have access to this. So right down here, they have a tile for searching military records. So for instance, let's say I know my grandfather served in the World War II. So I'm going to do a search for him. So he had a pretty common name. Common enough name, so I'm going to need to put in more information because if I put in William just his name, there's going to be over almost 3,000 records that turn up. So I'm going to narrow this down. So he was from Rhode Island. So I'm going to put in Rhode Island, and I know the year he was born. And now we're just going to do a search for that. Okay, and so now we have his enlistment record and and his draft card. So these are things that can be pretty interesting. So these can be pretty cool, especially if you don't have a picture of them, because they will have a description. So this will have his hair color, which was red. That was actually his nickname. He had bright orange hair. Everyone called him Red. And eye color, and also if you click on these draft cards, it'll tell you where they lived at the time that they registered. So this is something that would have happened. This is after he was discharged. I guess he filled this out. So that's his signature there. I can tell you that actually is his signature. So that is something that's pretty cool. And so it'll tell you where he lived. That's where he lived at the time. And it'll tell you how old he was, his birthday, where he was born. And on the other side, if you click on this arrow here, this will have a description. So if they had any identifying features, so if, for instance, if they had a birthmark or an obvious mole or some kind of scarring, it'll have that here. So this can be pretty cool if you don't have any pictures of the person that you're researching. So the other thing that is cool about Ancestry, they will have suggested records on the side here. So you can find different other records if you're just looking more generally, if you're looking outside of military records. So, aha, here we go. So this is something that's kind of quirky that I just like to show people because I think it's interesting. So there's is a collection called Jewish, sorry, I have a tooth missing. I got a little bit of a list, Jewish servicemen cards. So this is something that folks would generally, where they got this information from, they would see a person's name in a casualty list or POW list, and they would think that they were Jewish, so they would report it to the National Jewish Welfare Board. What I can tell you is that my grandfather was not Jewish, he was Catholic. So this was not entered by anyone he knew. This was entered by a person named Harry Hoffman. We probably saw my grandfather's name listed as a prisoner of war because he was a prisoner of war. I thought Herman sounded like a Jewish name. So he submitted it. So there's a lot of mistakes in this because you can see here, if it has a little circle here punched in this here, that means they weren't actually Jewish after all. But this can still be this is just something that's interesting. So even if you have a relative you're looking for World War II who wasn't Jewish, they might still wind up in here like my Irish Catholic grandfather. So I just like showing this to folks. I just thought it was amazing when I first found this a couple of years ago. Okay, so that's just a taste of what Ancestry has. So American Ancestors, this is something that you can only access at the Central Library, the Boston Public Library. I don't know how widely available it is elsewhere. You can get your own subscription to it. This is something you can subscribe to. So they do have a lot of free resources. So this is generally what the search page looks like. So again, you could just type in military, you could just type in a person's name. For instance, let's say I want to try and find my great-great-grandfather who served in the Civil War. There we go. So again, you just put in the name, you're going to get a lot of records that probably aren't correct. Like for instance, I know this is not him because he was deceased by 1900. So we're going to refine that. So I know when he died. So let's just say if I'm just looking for Civil War records, I'm just going to limit it to the years of the Civil War and see what comes up. There you go. So now we only get 8 records. So this actually is him. I can tell you, so this is his death record. So you can get that way. They also will have pension records. That's primarily going to be for the Revolutionary War, but that's basically how this works. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because I suspect a lot of you folks won't be able to get to this one. So we also have a few newspaper databases. Just in general, even if you're not in Massachusetts, newspapers can be a really great resource for finding information about someone. This is especially true if the person you're researching was killed in action or was a prisoner of war or received medals or for good conduct or did something interesting they might have been written about in the newspapers. For the Civil War, oftentimes a local newspaper where a regiment or a particular unit was from would have periodic updates as to what their movements were. So this is how I found out almost, what was going on in the unit my great-great-grandfather served in the Civil War. Their local newspaper constantly was updating about what they were doing, who was sick, who had died, and so on and so forth. So newspapers in general can be a really good resource if you're looking for a military relative or ancestor. So another thing we have, and this is something that anyone can access, this is freely available online. What we have are military registers. We had a grant years ago to digitize a lot of these. So we have different registers for officers and agents that covers the 19th century. We have the Army Register. This is something, if you Google it, you'll be able to find that. You'll also find links to this in our research guide, which I will be showing you in a little bit. But you can see here, this record is the link. Okay, so here we go. So the links to the digitized ones are in here. So we're going to click that. These are all in the Internet Archive, which is why, like I said, if you Google it, you'll probably be able to find it. So let's see if I can make this a bit bigger for everyone. There we go. Okay, so, oops, can't see it now. There we go. Okay, so this is from 1817. This has a list, register of officers that were in the military in 1817. So it also has information about ships and vessels, and also different officers in the government. So this will also have customs officers. So this is a pretty interesting resource if you're looking that far back. So we have different registers. We have an Army register, we have the Navy directory, we also have registers for the Air Force and the Coast Guard. Okay, let's see. There we go. Okay, so again, this is BPL books. So I've put together a few book lists with published records. We're going to take a look here at the Civil War. So a lot of these have been digitized. So even if you don't live around here, you can probably still access a lot of these. So for instance, this book right here, Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors and Marines in the Civil War, this is all online. So you can copy and paste this link to look at this on HathiTrust. So again, this is just Massachusetts. I believe every state that was involved in the Civil War has a similar register. So this is something that if you are researching someone from another state, if you check with your local library or your state library, they can probably help you tell you how to find this, because this was a federal law. All the adjutant generals in each state had to put this together. So every state that was around during the Civil War should have one of these records or something very similar. So just to give you a taste of what it looks like. So the Massachusetts records, they're organized by unit. So you're going to have to figure out which unit the person was in, and then it's organized alphabetically by name. So let's see. Get to, there we go. So this will have, and the officers will be listed first, and then the enlisted men. So this will have their name, their rank, where they lived, how old they were when they enlisted, their occupation. In the case of officers, their commission date, when they mustered in, when they were discharged. Also, if the person died, it'll say in here when they died. Most of these folks mustered out. So this can be a really good starting point if you're researching a Civil War ancestor. This can give you information about where you can go for further information. Okay, let's close a few of these. Go. Okay, oh yes, and Doreen is right. There's also, so again, I'm just referring to the books. There were books published. So depending on how you prefer to do research, some folks might find looking through the books a little easier. The National Park Service does have the Soldiers and Sailors database. We're going to take a look at that in a little bit. It is, I personally found the books a lot easier to search through than the database. It's kind of clunky search, but again, to each their own. I just include this for folks who might prefer to look through books rather than do a federal database. But these books were put together by state, not federally. So the National Park Service is a different thing than what these books are that I just showed you. Okay, so we have a bunch of different research guides that are also related. So we do, if you're curious about Massachusetts' involvement during the Revolutionary War, you can take a look at that. But for now, we're just going to take a look at the military records thing. So here we go. So this will have most of what I'm going to be talking about here. And again, this research guide is freely available on the internet. You don't have to be in Massachusetts to look at this. There's links to lots of other free resources. So here we have links to the Army registers we were talking about. So the Army registers we have from 1813 all the way up to 1969. So that covers a pretty good span of time. So back to the Soldiers and Sailors database. Let's take a look at that. So let me see if I can. Okay, thought I had, okay, so I will have to fix that. Okay, so let me, yeah, so I'll just pull, oh, look, I'm sorry, that's the Civil War, silly me. Okay, so let's see, there is not an equivalent for the Revolutionary War. So here we go. So this is what Doreen was referring to, the Soldiers and Sailors database. That's put together by the National Park Service. The books were put together, that I was talking about, were put together by the Adjutant General of each state's military forces. So that's where the National Park Service got their information from. But you can't, if you prefer to look for, if you want to look for these things online, you can do it that way. They also, what's also pretty cool about them, they have a bunch of regimental histories that you can search for. They'll have information about different battles and cemeteries. Well, let's say I want to look up for my great-great-grandfather in here. So we'll click on the soldiers. So this is what I mean. It's a little, like I said, I'm on a bias, I'm a librarian. I like to look at books, but it is a little clunky because even though all you can search for is a name and it's not terribly helpful, the first result is not the right person that I'm looking for because you can't put in any other identifying information. All you can put in is a name. So it's not perfect. It's still really cool that they did that. So, but in order to use this successfully, you will have to know more about what unit they were in order to figure out whether or not it's the right person. So this is the person I was looking at. So this is pretty much the same information that's going to be in those books. I'll have his rank and so on and so forth. However, the books will also have when he died. He did die during the war. So the books for that we were just looking at, that would have that information in here. The National Park Service database does not have that. So it doesn't have quite as much information as the books do, but it is incredibly useful, especially if you don't have access to those book sets. So we're not going to go into too much detail. They got a lot more to go to, but as I said, everyone will be getting a copy of this in there's a link to all of these guides in your handouts, and you'll also be getting a copy of my slides tomorrow, so you can take a look at more of these later. So we're going to move beyond the BPL. We're going to take a look at a few websites that were done by the US government and the US military. So every branch of the US Armed Forces has some sort of division or group devoted to the history of the armed forces. So the Air Force has their own thing, Navy has their own thing, Coast Guard has one, the Marine Corps has one, so they all have their own thing. So my favorite one personally though is Naval History and Heritage Command. The reason I like them so much, they have a ton of pictures of old ships. So if you're researching a ship, see here, they have ship histories, and I just think that is so cool. That's why I really like this resource. They also have other photographs. They'll have photographs of sailors. They'll have photographs of lots and lots of things. It is a pretty cool resource if you're looking to know more about the Navy. And you can also contact them and if you have questions about a particular aspect to do with the Navy. So as I said, every armed forces branch has their own history-based thing. So we're not going to look at all of those. But another good resource is the American Battlefield Monuments Commission. So this is a database of Americans only from World War I and World War II who died and are buried overseas. So this is not going to have folks who died overseas and then were later repatriated and buried in the United States. It's only going to have folks who were buried overseas. So I personally don't have any relatives who are buried overseas, but I'm just going to put in my grandfather's last name anyway and see what comes up. We're probably going to get a lot of results because Foreman's a fairly common name, but we'll see what happens. Okay, so got 167 results. So just for the heck of it, let's take a look at Abraham. So you click on the last name. So this is to give you their service number, which is basically what you need to find any record with the federal government. So the service number is a really good thing to have. It'll tell you his unit, his rank, where he entered the service from, the date of his death, and where he's buried, and right down to the plot number. So if this is something you wanted to, if you ever found yourself in Belgium and you wanted to see his grave, you would be able to find it. And also down here, we'll have any commendations he had. So this person had a silver star and a purple heart. So this is a really great resource. Again, this is just for servicemen from World War I and World War II who are buried overseas, which is unfortunately quite a lot. So let's see if we can get back. Okay, there we go. Okay, so in addition to the Civil War Soldiers and Sailors database, the National Park Service also has a Mexican War Soldiers and Sailors database. So Mexican War is one that not a lot of folks think of. So you can see here, I don't know if you remember, but when we were looking at the Civil War database, they had over 6 million results. This one, there's about 90,000, but it's pretty much set up exactly the same. Oh, so let's see. So I have a name for, okay, so someone gave me a name to check for the, all right, so, okay, so Brenda's looking for Eldon Kern. So let's do that. So we'll do Eldon Kern. Let's see what comes up. Okay. So there's no results. So there's a few different reasons why that could be. That could be, like I said, that's only people who are buried overseas. Like, for instance, there's a friend of my mother's family who died in France and was initially buried there. It was initially buried there, but was eventually moved back to the United States. So he's not going to be in here because he's not buried overseas. So we just did a search for the last name. Okay, let's see. If we can find, yeah, so there's no Eldon Kern listed here. My guess is that would be because he was like the family friend of my mother, from my mother's family. He was probably eventually moved, his remains are probably moved back to the United States at some point in time, like what happened to it was my grandmother's, a friend of my grandmother's. So that's what happened to him. So he's not going to be listed in here either because he is buried in Massachusetts, even though, oh, Alden. Okay, so, oh, okay. So we had a different spelling, so that might also be it. So that's something we also, it's not very forgiving, as like, it's not like Google where it'll say, did you mean so-and-so? You have to spell things exactly right. So there is an Alden. Okay, so let's click on this one. No, we don't want to do the survey. Okay, so I don't know if this is the person that Brenda is looking for. So this is someone who was in the Navy, Naval Reserve from Texas, who died in 1945. So it doesn't say where he died, and also the status of this person is MIA. So there's just a memorial for them in Honolulu. So if there's a memorial for them in Honolulu, that means, yeah, they probably were in the South Pacific or involved in that side of the war. But yeah, so this is just going to be a cenotaph. So they don't, it looks like he's not actually buried there. So I don't know if this is the person you're looking for, Brenda, but I will put in a link to that in the chat if you want to take a closer look at that. Okay, onward and upward. All right, so there's also a bunch of websites that are not done by the government that can also be pretty useful. There's familysearch.org, which is basically like Wikipedia for genealogy. This is done by Family Search. Like I said, it's basically Wikipedia for genealogy. They have compiled links to where available records are online. If it's a subscription-based website, it'll have a little $ next to it. If it's free, it'll tell you that. All right. Okay, yes, there is a handout. Let me pop the link in there for you. And there we go. Alrighty. So yeah, so this is familysearch.org. And they also have a lot of articles on here about how to do various aspects of research. So let's see. So there's also some, internment.net. If you've heard of Find a Grave, it's very, very similar. It's just laid out slightly differently. And these are all pretty similar. Some of them might have different links though. So they're already there's going to be a lot of overlap in records, but some of them might have things the other ones don't. But the one I really want to show you is the National Purple Heart Hall of Honor. So this is a database. This is not going to have everyone who's ever gotten a Purple Heart. There unfortunately isn't such a resource that will list everyone who has a Purple Heart. This is only folks who have been enrolled in the Hall of Fame, generally by a relative. So this is something you can do once you have all the records you want. If you have a relative who had a Purple Heart and you'd like them to be in the hall, then you can do that. So for instance, my grandfather had a Purple Heart, but he's not in there because no one's enrolled him. I have to get a lot more paperwork before I can do that. So I'm not able to do that yet. But again, I'm just going to pop in his last name to see if there are any Hermans in there. There we go. So this is going to have folks from all different branches, from all different conflicts. So for instance, when we have just in this row, we have someone from the Korean War, a couple people from World War II. Some of them will have pictures. There's some from Vietnam, some from the war in Afghanistan. So this can be pretty interesting. But again, these are just people who were submitted. It's not going to be everyone. Unfortunately, like I said, there is no resource that has everyone who's ever had a Purple Heart. This is the closest we have. So if you know someone who had a Purple Heart, you can see if they're in there, or you can put them in yourself if you have the paperwork. Okay, so we're going to take a little detour and talk about some local Massachusetts archives, because again, this is the Boston Public Library. So we're going to need to talk about some local stuff. And these resources can also be useful if you're researching someone from Massachusetts. So the Massachusetts State Archives is going to be a big one. So they do have military records of all residents of Massachusetts in the armed forces prior to 1940. So that's before World War II. So they will have basically going from World War I backwards is what they will have. So if you look at this link, this will basically just tell you the kinds of things they have. They have a bunch of things from the colonial wars, the Revolutionary War, Shays Rebellion. If you're from Central Mass, you'll know what that was. So this will basically just tell you what they have. So records from 1940 onwards are held by a different archive, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So to access their records, you will need to contact them. The other thing is so they also have things like muster rolls from the colonial wars. Oops, there we go. Muster rolls from the colonial war. So that includes not just the Revolutionary War, but it'll have King Philip's War, the French and Indian War. So they have a really vast collection that covers almost the entire history of the state, going way back into the colonial era. So for records from the 1940s to the present, you'll want to go to the Massachusetts National Guard Military Records Branch. So just like the state archives, they will have records of all servicemen who are residents of Massachusetts from 1940 onward. So they're going to have World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. So that's basically, those are the main time periods they cover right here. I don't think they're going to have anything. So there will have just things like discharge records, various other things. So they're going to have a lot here. So if you have someone who served in the military more recently from Massachusetts, you would want to go to the National Guard Records Branch. So also locally, we have a branch of the National Archives, which we're going to be talking about next. So they do have records relating to the Navy and the Marine Corps specifically, with operations based in the New England region. So this is not necessarily going to cover personnel records, things like that, but if you're looking for just information about things that took place here, the Coast Signal Service, this is some of the things that they have right here. If you had anyone who worked in a Navy Yard, so at the Boston Navy Yard in Charlestown, or at the Portsmouth Navy Yard up in Hampshire, they do have some stuff that covers those. So if you're researching that period of time, that location, you would want to go to the National Archives in Boston. However, they're actually at Waltham. They are not technically in Boston, but they call themselves National Archives at Boston because I guess no one outside of Massachusetts knows what Waltham is. So I've always found that amusing. Okay, now the big one, which is the National Archives and Records Administration. Just for brevity's sake, I'm just going to be calling them the National Archives, but their full name is National Archives and Records Administration. Excuse me. So this is the organization that you're going to want to talk to if you want something like a full personnel record that has information about enlistment, residence, any engagements they were involved in, where they're posted, anything like that. They're the ones that are going to have complete records forever relatives. So this is all over the country. So there's 2 different places where they have records. So in Washington, D.C., they'll have service prior to 1917, so before World War I. From 1917, so from World War I to present, that's going to be in St. Louis, Missouri. So they do take requests online via mail, and I think they're doing in person again, but that's something I would double check on if that's something you plan to do. I know since COVID lockdown, it's been a little tricky being able to get in there. So definitely call ahead. It wouldn't just show up to either of those locations. So good things to know about them. So records of individuals who left the service 62 years ago or more, those are considered public records. So they can be requested by anyone. So for instance, that's why I was able to, even though I am a relative, but basically anyone could have requested my great-great-grandfather's service record from the Civil War. Okay, so Marguerite is saying they're doing in person, but you have to register first. So that's okay. Yeah, so that's a relatively recent development. So thank you, Marguerite. So yeah, so it is a little tricky. That's something I would definitely email or call them first before you even get started on that, so they can explain to you their process. So if you're doing less than 62 years ago, those can only be requested by the individuals themselves, or if that person is deceased, their next of kin. So for instance, only my mother, my brother, and myself would be able to request my father's record from the Vietnam War because it was less than 62 years ago that he was discharged. So the National Archives defines next of kin as an unremarried widow or widower. So my mother still would be able to do that because she is not remarried. So son, daughter, father, mother, brother, or sister of a deceased veteran. So it's pretty limited. So if you're researching someone who was discharged fairly recently and you're not one of these people, you're not going to be able to get it. Like I said, at the time I was doing my grandfather's record, it was outside this time range, so my mother had to sign the paperwork because she was my grandfather's daughter, so she was allowed to do it. I, as a granddaughter, was not. So depending on who you're looking for, if you might not be able to request a record yourself, but if you know someone who's a next of kin who would be happy, who you can ask them if they'd be willing to just sign the paperwork for you. Like I said, with my mother, I filled everything out, got all the numbers and everything, and she just signed it. So if you know someone who would be willing to do that for you, that's a way you can kind of get around that. But that is pretty serious restriction, especially if you're looking for, like my father, from Vietnam, or if you're looking for the war in Afghanistan or any of the recent conflicts. The most important thing to know, however, especially if you're researching folks from World War I and World War II, in 1973 at the St. Louis facility, there was a very serious fire, and that destroyed millions and millions of records. So that includes most records for people who served in the Army in World War I and World War II. So when I did the request for my grandfather, unfortunately, that was the case. He was in what is now the Air Force, but at that time was the Army. So his record was with the Army, and unfortunately, we got the notice back that his record was one of the ones that was destroyed. So I'm not going to go too much into that. If you're interested in learning more about the fire, can look at that. I will say, if you're looking for someone who falls in that line, still definitely check in with them. They do have some replacement records. They've been working on putting some stuff together, so they might still have something, even if they don't have the personnel file you're looking for. Definitely still reach out to them because there might be something. But I just want to show you, so this article here has some pictures, so I can show you, here we go. So it was a really serious fire. It took a long time to put it out. You can see here, they're actively fighting the fire. It took, and here you can see it basically destroyed most of this top floor here. You can see there's burned whole gigantic holes right through the roof. It was a really devastating fire. You can see here the damage of the fire afterwards and what happened to the records. So, but like I said, if what you're looking for falls in here, you can still reach out to them because they do have some stuff, even if the record that you want was destroyed. Okay, let's see. Okay, so again, so you have all these links in your handout, so I'm not going to look at all of them. This is basically, the National Archives has a vast website, so I just pulled some links together for you that are just useful for this kind of research, so you don't have to go hunting all over their website. So they have a bunch of different guides that'll tell you what they have, how to do research, how to do genealogy research in particular. Most important thing, though, if you're looking for post-World War I records, it will be this link here because it's Form 180 is what you're going to need to fill out. So there'll be a link to the form here. So this is something, basically for this kind of thing, you will need to print out a form, fill it out, and either mail it to them or fax it to them. They're not taking a lot of requests online for if you're using Form 180. So this is the form I had to fill out to get to request my grandfather's records. So there's also different offices you can go to in person to get it, or if you just can't get to the form, you can write them a letter, and this is the information that you'll need to include. But let's see if we can take a look at the form here. So the form will have very detailed instructions, and it'll mention about the fire and that some records might not be available. So this is the form basically that you will need to fill out. This is everything that you would need if this is what you're doing. So I also filled out a similar form for my great-great-grandfather's record for the Civil War. That was a little easier because there wasn't much and it was so long ago. Okay, so let me see. All right, so that's the most important link for that if you do intend to request records from the National Archives and you already have. Okay, so here's the handout for anyone who came in a little late. So just a reminder, this class is being recorded. So, and I will be sending a link to everyone who's registered in a couple of days once it's up there. So if you missed anything, don't worry, you'll be able to watch it again. Okay, now we have time for questions. I see there's a few in here already. So I'm just going to look through these and see what folks are asking for. Just bear with me a moment. Okay, let's see. All right, so Penelope is asking, she says, Civil War relative joined the 31st Mass Regiment Company E in 1862. Would he have a personnel file? He never rose above private and became an alcoholic in Springfield. I found an enlistment card and I've been to his gravesite in Springfield. So yes, there will be something. It's not going to be a nice thick file like you would get for more recent things. What you probably will get is like what I got from my great-great-grandfather. It just is a photocopy of a set of slips, basically different times that they did roll call. Let's say he was present or he wasn't present and the reason why. And there might be things like pay slips in there. If he was a deserter, there might be a record related to that. So there will probably be something, even if he was kind of a troubled person. There will be something, and there just might not be much, but they should be able to give you something. Like I said, there wasn't much for my great-great-grandfather because he only served for 2 years and he died. So There was basically, it was a record of his death and then muster slips. That's basically all there was for him, but that's still something. Okay, Richard's asking, is there any way in the future that people who have a BPL card can get access to Ancestry without being in the library? I don't think so. I know it's a little confusing because we did have access to that remotely during COVID lockdown, but that ended about a year ago. So that's really not something we have any control over. That was Ancestry.com that allowed us to do that. Our license with them restricts who can use it and where. So because it's kind of expensive, we can't allow people to access it from home, or we would lose access to it. That's just the nature of our agreement with them. If they ever do decide to let us do that remotely, we'll be shouting that from the rooftops. Don't worry. But right now, I wouldn't hold my breath on that. Okay, so Brenda's asking, where would Navy records for the ship The Independent be located for the years 1852 to 1862? So that's something you can look at. There might be some stuff up on Ancestry.com. You can also look at the like I said, the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command. They do have ship histories. So let me see if I can get back there. Okay, so the Independent. So let's see if they have. Okay, so we're going to go back here and find ship histories. Okay, so let's look at the eyes. So IMB, let's see. Okay, so there's nothing for independent. Guessing you might have meant independence. If I'm wrong, please let me know. But yeah, they don't have anything listed for independent, just independence. Could be independent. Okay, so if you're saying from 1850s and 60s, it's probably this one. So let's take a look at that. So there we go. So yeah, so there's going to be a nice long, so there is, if this is the right ship, there is a nice long history for it here. So, and there might be some other things here, but yeah, there's not a heck of a lot because that is an older ship. They do tend to have richer histories for more recent things. So for ships involved in World War I and World War II, they tend to have a lot more on, but I will put that link in there for you. Okay, let me see. Okay, sorry, just trying to catch up here. Okay. Okay, so Sheila's asking, can you find out what battles a person participated in World War II? So that's something, I don't know if that information is not necessarily going to be, I don't know, easy to find, but that's something where if you know the name of the company they were in or their unit, that's something, if you do a search for them online, you should be able to find a regimental history. There's a lot of regimental histories for World War II, so that's how you would find that out. You're not necessarily going to find that out from a personnel record because of issues I've already said, but if you know what unit they were in, if you do a search for them, a lot of units have like alumni resources. They'll have websites to organize reunions, so they'll have information about them there. So that's the kind of place you might be able to find out. But let me see. I think there actually, let me take a look. I think there is a link in here to something. Let's see, World War II. Aha, here we go. So that's something, if you take a look at some of the websites we have here, I've linked to here. So something like Cindy's List might have links to different websites. There's a bunch of different random websites that are basically, they were started by veterans or relatives of veterans who might have just put that information up themselves. There's a few different databases from the National Archives, but they don't really focus on what battles each person fought in. So that it's kind of hard to find. The information is out there, but it's not easy to find. That's something you'll basically have to hunt for. Okay, let's see. Okay. So Elizabeth is asking, if an uncle never was married or had children, would a niece or nephew be able to research his records? So that's related to that. So that if he was discharged less than 62 years ago, then no, you wouldn't be able to access that. Because a niece or nephew is not considered next of kin. So I, for instance, wouldn't be able to request my uncle's service record for Korea. I would have to see if one of my cousins would be willing to do that. But again, if he never married or had kids, that's going to be kind of tough. If he has a sibling who's still alive, they should be able to do that. Let me see if that is in. Yeah, so if he basically, you're not going to be able to get it. If there's no one to do it for you, like a sibling or a parent, you're basically just going to have to wait until it's considered public record. Unfortunately, that's just it's basically related to privacy laws, is why they have that restriction. So that's something, if you don't know anyone who can do it for you, you're going to just have to wait it out. Okay, so Ron's asking, I sent an inquiry to NASA. I'm assuming you mean NARA. For great-grandfather's record in the beginning of 2020, have they caught up on the COVID backlog? No, they have not. There's been lots of complaints about how long it's taking, but unfortunately, it's just they're very understaffed. The previous administration cut their budget, so they have not nearly caught up to the COVID backlog. So request times are pretty long, so that's something to keep in mind if you do put in a request. It's a very, very long wait. So Christina's asking, what if there are no next of kin living? Like I just said, you're gonna just have to wait until it's been more than 62 years, unfortunately. That's just sadly the way it is. Okay, let's see. So Robert's asking, my dad was in the Merchant Marines. Where can I find information on him? He served there during World War II and was drafted and the ship was sunk, but he survived. When he got back, he was arrested because he didn't report to the draft. Goodness. So I'm not really 100% sure about that, to be honest. So let me see. Merchant Marines is kind of tricky because I don't know a lot about that. Let me see if Cindy has anything here for Merchant Marines. That might be something, if you know what unit they were in, you could see if there's an alumni group or anything like that that might have records. But let me just do a quick Google search here. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, that is also National Archives. So you would want to get in touch with them too. I'm not sure what they're going to have. It's probably going to be different than what is available with Army and Navy and Marines and the Air Force, but check with the National Archives because it looks like they do have some things. That's an interesting story, though, that he was arrested for failing to report to the draft when he was already in the military. That is really interesting. Okay, so Karen's asking, can I get a marriage record for my parents married on the base World War II? So fortunately, that's your parents. You should be able to get something because you're considered next of kin. So I'm not sure what they're going to have for marriage records. It depends, basically. So that's something I'd check with the National Archives. Also, there should be, wherever that was, it also should have been registered in the town where it occurred. So you could also check with the library, the public library where the base was, to see if they could tell you what kind of records they might have. Okay, let's see. Okay, so Meg says, Uncle served in Vietnam, his DD-214. So for those who don't know, DD-214 is their discharge papers. So DD-214 from basic training indicates he left service, but he has reserve unit stubs from after his basic training. He told us that he served at the CIA, but couldn't elaborate what's the best location to search for his records. So if he was involved in the CIA, I don't think you're going to be able to get anything. You can check with the National Archives, but I wouldn't really hold my breath on that, because if he really was involved with the CIA, they're probably not going to tell you what he did. So that's unfortunately, that's kind of a tricky one. You're probably not going to get anything. Oh, so okay. So let's see. Brenda's saying, so the Navy frigate Independence at work. Oh, so that's a Boston ship. Let's see. So no, that's a sloop. I'm sorry, we're going back to the Independence here. That's a cargo ship. So yes, Independence is a really common name for ships. Okay, so it looks like they don't have anything for that particular ship there, but that's something. If it was New York City, there might be a historical society that might have information, or the New York Public Library might have something. So that's where I would check. So Deborah's asking, what is the difference from the library ancestry versus the version I pay for? One librarian told me I would have access to more info from home. Another said the library version has more info. Okay, so the actual truth is the only difference between the library ancestry and the one in the personal subscription is in the library version, you can't save records to your family tree. You can't access a private family tree, and you can't create one. That's the main difference, because you're using our account. And so we have what's called an institutional subscription. So you can't create or add to your family trees in that. That's really the only difference between the two. It's the same exact records. You're still paying to, in one case, you're paying yourself to access them. In another case, you have to come in to use our subscription. That's really the only difference, is the family tree. Okay, so Marguerite's asking, have you heard of the subscription-based American Civil War database that was recommended to me? I have not heard of that one. I am not familiar with that. So it looks like, yeah, so I'm not familiar with this one, but that's something, if you want to try it out, definitely, it's up to you. I can't recommend or endorse anything. I've not heard of this one, so I'm not familiar with it. So I would just say be careful. Okay, so Ron is saying, Great White Fleet question. Okay. My great-grandfather served as a Marine 1907 to 1910. He was stationed on the USS Minnesota and USS Wisconsin for the whole trip around the world on the Great White Fleet. I have not found a peacetime database. So that's, again, so you want to go to the National Archives for his personnel file, because that's where any records are going to be. It doesn't matter if it was peacetime. It doesn't have to be they served in a war. The National Archives will have a record. You could also check with a library in the state he was from. There might be some state archive records. If he wasn't from Massachusetts, you could check with whatever other state archive there was. There will still be a record of him. They don't just have military records if you served in a war. It's just that's what that's what a lot of people are interested in. So that's just a lot of the information that was out there. But peacetime, there will still be records, but I would check with the National Archives. Okay, let's see. So Renee's asking, my uncle was in the Marines about 1930. I have a picture in uniform, but don't think he served long. How could I find out if he actually served? So the Marines, you're lucky those records weren't burned up. So that would just be the National Archives. Again, that's your uncle. You're not gonna, so let's see. You might actually be able to do that, because that sounds like he was probably discharged more than 62 years ago. So you should actually be able to request his record. So just National Archives, you can find that out. Okay, so Marguerite says, when I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. last month, they told me I had to find the information about my Civil War ancestor on ancestry.com first. And with that, I could fill out the form to get info at the archive. So I guess you could save time by doing the ancestry search first. Yes, so that is true. And they also told me they cannot find the files if you don't. That's true. They can't, there isn't a name index. So I told you when I was showing you the books, those are not laid out by name. You have to know the unit in order to find any records. So the same is true at the National Archives. That's why you do searches beforehand, because they will need to have the unit. Like I had to figure out what unit my great-grandfather was in before I could do that. Okay, so Brenda says, if the only document I have is the enrollment of ex-soldiers and sailors, their widows and orphans of the late armies of the United States residing in the state of Kansas. His name is listed as Orrin Lyons, rank and discharge private, North Company Regiment, New York Navy frigate Independence. He was in service for 31 months, and his date of birth is about 1834 in New York State. None of us can locate anything. Where would you suggest? Oh, that's a tough one. So it sounds like what you have is probably a pension record. Okay, so Navy, yeah, and then so okay, so Navy frigate independence. So what you might want to check, it sounds like he might have been in the state Navy as opposed to the U.S. Navy. Because there were individual navies for different states, so it sounds like it might be something like that. So in that case, I would check if you know what town he was from, check with them, or check with the New York State Library to see what they might have, because that's what it sounds to me like what they did, what happened. So I would try that. Okay, let's see. Is there any database for the Civil Air Patrol? I don't know what that is. Let me see. Okay, so that is not a government organization. That is, looks like, okay, so it looks like if Wikipedia is to be believed, it's a federally supported nonprofit corporation. So that means they're not run by the government, they receive funding from the government. So that's going to be a whole nother ball of wax. So that's something you'd probably need to contact them directly to see what they might have. Okay, so Victor is commenting regarding the question, can we find out what battle someone participated in? Unit histories and after action reports will capture major leaders and significant actions by individuals of any rank. That is true. So if you can find a regimental histories are great resources, and they do have them for World War II. That's how I found out information about my grandmother's friend. It was really, really useful. My dad was a pilot in the, okay, so yeah, that's the Civil Air Patrol. Like I said, you're going to need to contact them directly because that's not technically a U.S. armed force. So that's something different altogether. It's a government, it's basically, think of it as a government contractor. That's technically what they are. So that's not going to be National Archives, and they might not have a publicly available database. So Richard's asking for records from the Vietnam War. It's still not public, right? My mom's aunt's husband served and I want to find more info. So yeah, that is correct. So that's less than 62 years ago. So you're not going to be able to find that. If you can find someone who is considered his next of kin, who is willing to do that for you, like I said, you might be able to get it that way, but otherwise you're not going to be able to request those records yourself because it's not public yet and you're not next of kin. Okay, so it looks like that's it for questions. So we do have a few more minutes. Do you have any more questions? Okay, so this is our last class for the fall. We haven't quite put together our schedule for the spring yet. We are working on that. There will be announcements for it. Oh, here we go. Let's see. So Renee's asking, how can I get my ancestor's Revolutionary War record? He was from Connecticut and served in New York City. So, okay. So that's interesting. Okay, so if he enlisted in New York City, which that might be, so New York City was occupied for a lot of the Revolutionary War, so that might be a little hard to find. So that's, again, I would check with the New York City Public Library, or if there's a historical society related, if you know a conflict that he was involved in, like a particular battle, or if you know what unit he was in, you can just ask for information about that. You could also check with the town he was from and see what was there. But yeah, that's pretty tough because he didn't enlist in the state where he was from. And New York City, like I said, was occupied for much of the Revolutionary War. So that's going to be a little tough to find information on. Okay, so Karen's asking, where can we find unit histories for World War II Army Air Corps? So again, that's something really, Google is your friend. That's how I found my grandmother's friend. Someone had written a book about that. So it's really just if you know the name of the unit, especially if the unit had a nickname, just do a search on Google, see if there's a website, see what you can stumble on. There might not be anything official. You can look at some of the World War II websites. Some of them will have unit histories, but there's not going to be anything, say, in the National Archives. There just might be other websites that might have stuff like that, or there might be books published. So that's something you would really need to know what unit that was. And it's really helpful if you know whether or not the unit had a nickname. If you know the unit had a nickname and you know it, that's the best way to find it, by looking for their nickname. So Teresa's asking, that was my question, when might your supervisors decide upon which topics and when available? Okay, so I actually decide what topics I present on. My boss gives me pretty free reign. I have a lot going on right now, so I haven't been able to put together my schedule for the spring yet. So I generally will look at what's going on in genealogy and what's been popular in the past, and to figure out what we're doing. So I also program a speaker series. So I generally wait until my speaker series is all scheduled, and then I plug in my classes around that, because the speakers, I have to work with their schedule. For the classes, it's just me, so it's easier for me to just plug myself into different open spots. So actually I decide what I do. So like I said, my boss gives me pretty free rein with these things. If there's anything anyone wants to see a class on, feel free to shoot us an email, and I will put something together if enough people are interested in it. So I do take suggestions. Okay, so Sarah's asking, my late husband's records from the Korean War were among those destroyed in the fire. So I have confirmation that he served, but is there anywhere I can find more detail on his service? So that's like what I was saying. You can do some searching on Google, see if you can find a regimental history, or if you know, actually, since it's sounds like if there's anyone that your husband served with who is still alive, you could ask them, or if they are relatives of people your husband served with, to see if they know of anything, if anyone has put together anything. Like, for instance, the book I found about my grandmother's friends unit, that was done by someone who was in that unit. So you can see if has someone written the book, has anyone put together anything. So that's something, since it sounds like there might still be some people alive that knew your husband, to check with, see if you can check with them to find out that, because if his record was destroyed in the fire, we're kind of out of luck there. But definitely you can keep checking back every few years or so with the National Archives, because technology has increased. They are putting some records back together, and they have pulled together some alternate information. So like I said, check with the National Archives, and if there's anyone still alive who knew your husband, check with them. Okay, let's see. So let's see. So Richard's asking, are you going to Roots Tech? Well, I'll be viewing the videos at Roots Tech. I'm not presenting at Roots Tech. I haven't been asked. If they asked me, I would. Okay, so Meg's asking, so yeah, this is a good reminder. So this was recorded, and I will be sending a link to this from our YouTube page once it's up, which will hopefully be in a few days. Our AV department is really busy though, so it might be a little while. And I will be sending you a chat transcript. There's going to be a link to that in the follow-up email tomorrow, along with the link to the handout and the link to my slides. Okay, so Teresa, let's see. She says, my grandfather James Dorman was conscripted by Burgoyne in England. Ooh. James is in the Battle of Saratoga and was captured. Where might I find out any information about him? Oh, the Battle of Saratoga. So, So Revolutionary War records, they do exist, but they're a little spotty. So that might be something. So if he was conscripted by Burgoyne in England, so those records would probably be in England, since it sounds like it was for that side. So they're the ones that are more likely to have it. You could check in Saratoga. Let's see. All right. Not sure. You could check with the Saratoga Public Library to see if they have anything. I think there's a historical society. Let me see. Aha. So there is the Saratoga. Okay, so the National Park Service has a presence there. So you could, so in that case, could contact the National Park Service and see if they might have an archive that has some information. You could check with Saratoga's the closest public library. I don't know if Saratoga Springs is going to have anything necessarily, because this is actually in Stillwater, not in Saratoga, the town of Saratoga. So that is, let me see, do they have a system? This is another tip I can give people. Oh, Saratoga County Historical. Okay, so if you're looking for information about a specific place, if you just type in the name and Historical Society and see what comes up. So there is a Saratoga County Historical Society. So they don't appear to have a website, but you can definitely try contacting them. Looks like they're in Ballston Spa, so you can see what they have. So historical societies can also be really good sources of information. That's not something that everyone knows. Okay, so Cindy saying for World War I, if your ancestor served overseas, you can go to Fold 3 and pull up the morning report. You'll need a unit company number. So yeah, Fold 3 we don't have access to here, so I can't really speak to how well it works since I haven't used it. But if you're able to access Fold 3, that is definitely an option. So if you do want to request a topic, you can send an email to me. I'm going to type in my email address in the chat box. So that's my email. If you have a suggestion for me for a topic, feel free to let me know. Okay, you can also there'll also be a space for any suggestions in the survey link, which is going to pop up once we close out here. So you could also type something in there if you have suggestions for future class topics. Okay, so Deborah's asking, my grandfather was in the Navy and worked on the USS Constitution rebuild. How can I find info about that work? So that would be National Archives. I think the Waltham National Archives would probably be the place to start with that. You could also just contact the Charlestown Navy Yard. That it is also a museum, so you could also check with them to see what they might have. Okay, let's see. All right, so I think we're just gonna go ahead and wrap up. So again, just more reminders. This is our last class of the fall. We will be back in the spring, and you will be back in March. I'd like to take a little bit of time off from these, also so I can put things together. So we were having our final local and family history lecture next Wednesday. There'll be information about that in the follow-up email. It's about accessing Catholic records. So if you're interested in that, definitely tune in for that. Everyone will be getting a follow-up email tomorrow that will have links to the chat transcript as well as the handout and my slides. And I will be sending a link to the recording to everyone who is registered once that's available up on YouTube. So I've seen some wonderful thank yous. Thank you everyone for coming. I've seen some great comments in here. Thank you so much. I do enjoy doing these, and I'm glad that I get to have such a wide audience from all over the country. It's really, really cool, and I'm happy that we can do that for everyone. So again, so I guess I'm just going to wrap up here. So thank you everyone for coming, and have a good weekend. And if I don't see you next week for the lecture, have a happy new year.